The camera lingers on a silent courtyard, its gravel pale beneath a merciless sun. A long line of Hungarian women stands rigid in the open air, their shadows sharp, their eyes hollow. The year is 1945. The war in Europe has not yet ended, but already the defeated are being gathered into camps, stripped of certainty and commanded into silence. Their hair is cropped short, their uniforms replaced with rough dresses, their names reduced to numbers called out by guards at roll call. Every breath feels like contraband. A whistle shrieks. The prisoners stiffen, expecting another hour of enforced stillness, another day of discipline designed to erase the self. But then something startling breaks the ritual, the scratchy crackle of a radio speaker, faint at first, swelling into melody. A popular American tune drifts across the yard. The guards glance at one another, then nod in quiet permission for the first time. The women are not commanded to stillness. They are allowed to move. One prisoner, her name recorded later as Eva Molnar, dared to hum. She was only 21, the daughter of a farmer from Szeged, and she had once sung in her village choir. Her voice was hoarse, fragile from weeks of hunger, yet it carried. Others turned their heads, startled, then slowly, timidly, joined her. Before long, a Hungarian folk song ancient, forbidden, was rising over the camp. The paradox was as brutal as it was liberating. Here, in captivity, where their bodies belonged to their captors, their voices suddenly belonged to no one but themselves. Their lips formed verses passed down by grandmothers, words of longing, of home, of harvest dances. Soldiers who had braced themselves for punishment now found themselves swaying ever so slightly, the rhythm of remembered dances seeping into stiff limbs. What began as trembling silence after roll call now rippled into a fragile murmur of freedom. The guards, too, seemed disarmed. Instead of shouting for order, they stood back, arms crossed, watching the unlikely performance unfold. A few smiled faintly. One reportedly tapped his boot in rhythm before catching himself. It was a scene no military manual had prepared them for, a prison camp transforming, for a few stolen minutes, into a village square. The image lingers, women swaying in mud-soaked shoes, their laughter mingling with tears, barbed wire glinting like cruel stage lights around their sudden stage. It is a contradiction that demands attention. Why would captors permit those they had defeated to sing, to laugh, even to dance in the shadow of barbed wire? What purpose could there be in such an act of leniency amid the machinery of war? The year was 1944, and Hungary had just been dragged deeper into the war than many of its citizens could comprehend. After the German occupation in March, thousands of Hungarian men were sent to the front, while women filled support roles, nurses, cooks, clerks, and in some cases auxiliary staff attached to German units, when the Soviet advance rolled through Eastern Europe. Many of these women found themselves swept up in chaos. Some were seized on the battlefield, others at makeshift hospitals, still others pulled from refugee columns that snaked westward. By the spring of 1945, the Allies were processing thousands of Hungarian women as prisoners of war. In American-run camps, their arrival was marked by confusion. Most had expected forced labor, humiliation, perhaps even summary punishment for aiding the German cause. The Geneva Conventions promised rights for POWs, but after years of propaganda, few prisoners believed such rules would be honored. They had heard rumors of starvation camps, of Soviet deportations to Siberia, and braced themselves for the worst. Their transport was itself a journey of fear, packed into trains that rattled across Central Europe. They pressed against one another in silence, broken only by the squeal of brakes or the rattle of tin cups. A single guard's shout could send a ripple of panic through the carriage. In diaries, later recovered, women described the overwhelming smell of fear, unwashed clothes, and the gnawing dread that they might never see Hungary again. One nurse, identified in camp records as Maria Kovacs, scribbled on the back of a Red Cross leaflet, "I expect to die in silence, nameless, in foreign soil. Better not to hope, because hope is a crueler torment." When they first stepped into American camps in Austria and Germany, what they encountered confounded their expectations. The barbed wire was real, the armed sentries visible. But there was also order, clean water, rations, and medical checks. Compared with the brutal stories whispered about Soviet camps, this was a paradox captivity. Yes, but not annihilation. Still, fear lingered. Roll call became a daily theater of control. At dawn, the women were driven into the yard, lined in rows, and counted under the eyes of guards. Each number shouted by the clerk reinforced their status as prisoners. Conversation was forbidden. Silence demanded. The women braced for this ritual of erasure, clutching their coats against the cold, expecting it to stretch on for hours. But slowly, routines began to shift. An American officer, Captain John Harrington, a former music teacher from Ohio, reportedly noticed the women's exhaustion. He made a decision, small at the time, but revolutionary. In its impact, he allowed the camp radio to play after roll call. His reasoning, noted in a later report, was simple. A measure of music may prevent despair from turning to unrest. The result was a fissure in expectation. The women, who had prepared themselves for silence, suddenly heard music fill the yard. They looked at one another in disbelief. This was not what they had been told captivity would be. Statistics give weight to this backdrop. By 1945, over 500 POW camps dotted the United States and occupied Europe, housing nearly 371,000 German and Axis prisoners in them. Music and cultural programs were sometimes used as morale tools for Hungarian women. Such leniency was unimaginable until the moment it happened. They had entered the camp expecting iron discipline. Instead, they found the faintest spark of unpredictability, one that would soon erupt into song. Morning mist hung low over the barracks, and the crunch of boots on gravel echoed as the Hungarian women filed into the yard. The roll call bell had become their daily summons, a ritual of submission that demanded stillness in the face of cold discipline. For many, it was the most dreaded hour of the day. They had learned quickly that lateness, whispers, or the simple act of shifting weight from one aching foot to the other could bring rebuke. Their expectations were grim, and they braced themselves accordingly. Prisoners often whispered at night about camps elsewhere, labor camps where silence was ironclad, where even humming could be punished as defiance. Each woman knew that roll call was not merely a count of bodies, but a rehearsal of control, a performance in which their captors reminded them who held power. A diary entry from one woman, identified later as Ilona Varga, captured the sense of dread. Every dawn feels like an execution without bullets. They strip us of speech, of movement, of being seen as human. We stand, and the hours crush our bones more than the cold. The numbers added to the weight. At its height, the yard might hold over 300 women, drawn from scattered Hungarian units, rows stretched across the open ground, shoulders squared, mouths sealed. The silence was so deep that the cough of a single guard seemed to rattle through the formation. This was what captivity was meant to feel like, the suffocation of voice, the grinding erosion of spirit. Yet beneath the rigidity, small rebellions stirred, a glance shared between friends, a smirk quickly hidden, even gossip, whispered through the night, carried into the morning's tales of stolen bread, of guards who favored certain groups, of arguments over whether survival required obedience or defiance. These fragments of humanity persisted like sparks under ash, waiting for air. One morning in late March 1945, as the prisoners braced again for silence, the tension felt heavier than usual. Word had spread that a stricter American officer had arrived, and the women expected harsher discipline instead. The unexpected occurred after the final number was called. No command for silence followed. The women stood frozen, uncertain. Was this a trap? A test of obedience? Into that silence drifted the faint crackle of a radio. The sound of foreign music filled the air, not loud, but enough to unsettle the grim ritual. For the first time, the silence did not press down on them. It opened, as though inviting something yet unnamed. It was not yet singing, not yet dancing, but the possibility trembled in the air, and the women felt it. Here, in the place they had expected only to endure suffering, the pattern of control had faltered, and with that hesitation, a door opened toward something they did not yet dare to imagine. The silence after roll call was different this time. The women remained in formation, uncertain, their eyes darting between guards and fellow prisoners. The air held a charge, as though something unseen was about to break. Then, from the far left row, a voice rose, not loud, not defiant, but trembling and hesitant. It was Eva Molnar, the farmer's daughter from Szeged, who had once sung in her village choir. She hummed the first line of a Hungarian folk tune, her voice cracking with nerves and hunger. The women around her froze. A hum could mean punishment, but the guards did not shout. Instead, they stood watching, one of them even lowering his rifle slightly, emboldened. Another woman joined Eva, then another, until a fragile chorus grew. What had begun as a solitary hum swelled into a full melody. Carrying across the courtyard, the sound was both haunting and defiant, the ancient rhythms of Hungarian life echoing inside a foreign prison. The shock was not confined to the women. The guards themselves seemed momentarily stunned. Some looked away, uncomfortable, as though glimpsing something too human for a war camp. One American private later recalled in a letter, "It was strange. They were supposed to be the enemy, but when they sang, I thought of my mother's church choir back home. For a moment, the war felt very far away. Then came the unthinkable." One of the women stepped forward, lifting the hem of her worn skirt just slightly, and began to move her feet in the rhythm of a csárdás, the traditional Hungarian folk dance. Others followed, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. Mud-soaked boots pounded out the rhythm, arms linked, steps swirling in patterns remembered from village festivals. Within minutes, the yard had transformed from a place of discipline into a makeshift dance floor. Laughter broke out, mingled with tears. Some women clutched each other's hands as they spun, while others stood weeping, too overcome to move. For them, the dance was not merely movement, it was a return to a world that had been stolen. A reminder of kitchens where mothers hummed while cooking, of barns where fiddlers once played deep into the night. The guards did not stop it. Perhaps they recognized its value. Perhaps they feared that breaking the moment would incite more unrest than allowing it. Or perhaps, for a fleeting instant, they simply saw the prisoners as human beings, whatever the reason. The dance continued until exhaustion overcame the women, and they stood panting, cheeks flushed, hearts pounding with something they had not felt in months' life. What had been expected as another morning of silence and control had reversed entirely. Captivity had yielded to rhythm, discipline to song, and in that reversal, a new possibility was born that even within a prison, spirit could not be wholly shackled. The courtyard, once defined by order and silence, now pulsed with something astonishing. The Hungarian women had turned captivity into a stage, and their songs gave way to full dances. The csárdás spread from one row to another, boots stomping in rhythm, skirts twirling despite their coarse fabric. Laughter erupted, at first nervous, then uncontrollable. It mingled with the sound of tears, because for many, joy and grief had become indistinguishable. One prisoner, Anna Horvath, later remembered in a post-war memoir how overwhelming the moment had been when my feet moved in the steps my grandmother taught me. I felt as if I were home again. For a heartbeat. I forgot the war. I forgot hunger. I was simply alive. Such testimonies reveal how deeply these spontaneous dances touched the prisoners, not as rebellion, but as survival. The guards, too, became unwilling spectators of a human drama they could not script. An American corporal leaned against the fence, chewing gum, muttering to another, "You'd think it was a wedding, not a prison yard." Yet even his words carried no contempt, only a kind of bewildered respect. Discipline had not dissolved, but it had shifted. Control now coexisted with an unexpected allowance space for the human spirit to rise above wire and rifles. As the music swelled, prisoners who had been too weak to stand the previous day now tapped their feet from the edges of the formation. Others whispered prayers between verses. A few clutched each other so tightly that their knuckles whitened. The dance had become not only a performance, but a ritual of memory. Each step carried them back to kitchens where mothers stirred stews, to harvest festivals under starlight, to childhood fields in the Hungarian countryside. The barbed wire seemed to blur, no longer defining the limits of who they were. And then the moment of crescendo, nearly the entire yard moving in unison, voices raised, boots stamping in rhythm. It was, for an instant, the sound of freedom itself echoing across captivity. The sheer contrast was enough to make many cry openly. "I had forgotten what it felt like to be alive," whispered one nurse, her voice trembling as if she feared the admission itself might shatter the illusion. When the last notes faded, silence returned, but it was a different silence, heavy with emotion, filled with the sound of ragged breathing and muffled sobs. The women stood flushed, exhausted, but changed. For them, the morning's ritual of submission had become an unexpected theater of humanity, and so the question lingers. Carried not only to the prisoners but to us as witnesses today, what is stronger, the chains of a prison, or the memory of a song if you had been among them? Would you have joined the dance, or stood watching with tears in your eyes? Share your thoughts below. Your reflections matter more than you realize. The dance did not vanish into memory. It became gossip whispered between bunks, smuggled into diaries, retold in fragments whenever silence grew too heavy. For many of the Hungarian women, it was the first time they dared to believe that captivity did not mean the death of spirit. They began to look for other ways to keep fragments of humanity alive. In one recovered notebook, its cover fashioned from a flour sack, a prisoner sketched the steps of a folk dance beside crude drawings of violins. She noted which verses of songs drew the loudest laughter, as if trying to preserve the recipe of joy. Another woman described in her hidden diary how a guard once left half a loaf of bread on the fence, pretending to look the other way. Gossip spread quickly. The Americans don't want us to break, they want us to live. Of course. Not all believed. Skeptics muttered that these moments were calculated, a trick to soften resistance. A bitter voice in the barracks warned, "They let us dance so we will forget we are still prisoners." Yet even the cynics could not deny the change that followed. Roll calls no longer felt like executions in slow motion, even in silence. Women hummed softly under their breath, trusting that guards would not punish them. The symbolism was not lost on American officers either. In a report preserved in camp archives, Captain Harrington observed, "Music does more than occupy prisoners. It reminds them of a world beyond fences. That reminder is more powerful than punishment." His words reflected a wider understanding. Cultural leniency could achieve what discipline could not. Numbers confirmed the reach of this quiet policy. By 1945, U.S. authorities had implemented educational and cultural programs in over 400 POW camps, ranging from music clubs to art workshops, while primarily aimed at German soldiers. The inclusion of Hungarian women added another dimension to show that America's strength was not only in weapons, but in its ability to preserve dignity, even in captivity. For the women, the meaning was immediate and personal. Music had become a gentle weapon, not wielded against them, but offered as proof that humanity had not been entirely consumed by war. They whispered among themselves, weighing its implications. Could it be that freedom was not wholly extinguished, even here? And so the paradox deepened. A prison yard had revealed a truth no bullet could enforce: that laughter, a song, even a dance could survive chains. Let me ask you, as you watch this story unfold, do you believe small gestures, a song, a loaf of bread, a moment of dance can change lives even in the darkest places, or are they fleeting illusions? Sparks in the night that vanish with the dawn. Share your answer below. Your perspective gives history a living voice. The Hungarian women carried the memory of those dances with them long after the war ended. For many, it was not the shouts of guards or the sting of barbed wire that lived in their minds decades later, but the echo of voices raised together in defiance of silence. Survivors testified in post-war interviews that those mornings after roll call became turning points, moments when despair loosened its grip and the idea of survival no longer felt impossible. One woman, Naj, wrote in a letter to her daughter years later, "I was a prisoner, yes, but when we sang, I felt my soul belonged to me again. The fences melted for a while. I still hear those songs in my dreams." Her words reveal how powerfully memory can outlive trauma, preserving not the details of hardship, but the fragments of resilience. Historians note that these cultural allowances were not random. American policy during the final stages of the war increasingly emphasized soft power. Guards and officers understood that fostering morale could prevent unrest and quietly demonstrate the contrast between democracy and dictatorship. In this sense, the dances were more than tolerated. They were a calculated symbol of American confidence. This was not the cruelty of gulags, nor the rigid silence of German camps, but an experiment in showing that dignity could be acknowledged even in captivity. The irony is striking. These women had marched into the camps expecting only degradation, only the annihilation of self. Instead, they discovered a strange inversion in losing their physical freedom. They uncovered an inner liberty they had not expected. In the midst of barbed wire, they rediscovered community, In the shadow of war, they resurrected joy. Statistics reinforce the scale of this phenomenon. Between 1943 and 1946, more than 371,000 Axis prisoners were held in America and Allied-administered camps in Europe. Countless diaries and oral histories record similar moments of cultural reprieve: concerts, plays, even Christmas celebrations behind wire. Each event carried the same message: the human spirit bends, but does not break. The symbolic power of the Hungarian dances lingered precisely because it turned captivity into contradiction. Roll call was meant to erase identity. Instead, it became a stage where identity returned, louder than ever, through melody and rhythm for the Americans. It was a soft victory. For the women, it was proof that spirit could not be entirely shackled. And for us today, the image remains unforgettable: rows of exhausted women in torn shoes, stepping into the patterns of folk dances that had traveled centuries, their voices soaring above the camp fence. It was not a military triumph, but something subtler, perhaps more enduring: the triumph of remembering what it meant to be human. History often remembers wars through battles and treaties, through the names of generals and the weight of casualties. Yet hidden within those vast numbers are fragile moments, small and almost impossible to measure, that reveal the resilience of the human soul. The Hungarian women who sang and danced after roll call were not heroes in the conventional sense. They carried no weapons, issued no commands, won no victories recorded in official archives. And yet, their steps, their voices, their refusal to surrender spirit to silence became a victory that outlasted the barbed wire. Decades later, survivors described how those moments continued to shape them. Some said they could still hear the rhythm of boots striking the ground, not as a march of soldiers, but as a pulse of life. Others remembered the tears that came unbidden, flowing not from grief, but from the shock of joy breaking through despair. Such memories lingered longer than orders, longer than the sound of rifles. They proved that even amid captivity, humanity could be reclaimed in song. There is symbolism here that reaches beyond the war itself. Armies destroyed cities, bombs flattened streets, but a single dance preserved a community's memory. A folk song became more enduring than propaganda, more nourishing than rations, in a world where power often claims victory through force. These women revealed another kind of strength, the kind that endures quietly, invisibly, yet refuses to be broken. We might ask ourselves today, what remains of us when freedom is stripped away? What survives when nations collapse? When silence is imposed, the women's answer was simple and profound: a song, a step, a memory of home. Their paradox lives on, a reminder that freedom of spirit cannot be conquered,